Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition, and we turn now to one of the longer poems actually in this edition, 430, It Would Never Be Common More, I Said. Now, in some ways, we're back to poem 299 and possibly hear part of that relationship history with Sue. There's, for sure, this is a poem about loss, no doubt. Now, who specifically she's in reference to, and why she had this amazing bliss and then it all turned into nothing, this poem doesn't tell us. You know, there are some who have argued that there is no poet who is greater at describing loss and suffering than Emily Dickinson, as she will do so regularly in these poems. Our assumption, so that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our set of introductory comments, and where we commented, obviously, on the importance of Sue in Emily's life. And then as well, I'm hopeful that you've read the preceding 429 poems in the Johnson edition. We just finished with 429, The Moon is Distant from the Sea. And if you have, then you can place a poem like this in its context. One scholar has pointed out that Emily is brilliant at silent suffering. But every once in a while, it isn't silent anymore. She says it this way. It would never be common more, I said. Difference had begun. Many a bitterness had been, but that old sort was done. Or, if it sometimes showed as twill upon the downiest morn, such bliss had I, for all the years 'twould give an easier pain. I'd so much joy, I told it, read upon my simple cheek. I felt it publish in my eye. 'Twas needless any speak. I walked as wings my body bore, the feet I former used, unnecessary now to me as boots would be to birds. I put my pleasure all abroad. I dealt a word of gold to every creature that I met, and dowered all the world. When, suddenly, my riches shrank, a goblin drank my due, my palaces dropped tenantless, myself was beggared too. I clutched at sounds, I groped at shapes, I touched the tops of films, I felt the wilderness roll back along my golden lines. The sackcloth hangs upon the nail, the frock I used to wear, but where my moment of brocade, my drop of India? I think it is a profound question that she ends with. Where is the thing I once had that was so amazing? It is interesting that bitterness gets used one and only one time in the Johnson edition, and it will be here in this poem. Now, it isn't clear what the antecedent to the pronoun it would be at the beginning. It would never be common more, I said. We can obviously assume that it's pain or suffering she's talking about. Difference had begun, she's looking back. Many a bitterness had been, again, bitterness only used in this moment. But that old sort was done. In other words, I made it out. Those of us who have struggled with some types of depression can appreciate totally what it is that she's saying here. Or, if it sometime, the it, again, the pain, showed as twill upon the downiest morn, such bliss had I. In 39 poems she uses the word bliss. For all the years 'twould give an easier pain. Notice easier capitalized. In other words, I was able to get through the little bits of pain that I still had because of this bliss. She said, I'd so much joy. 45 poems, Emily uses the word joy. I told it, read upon my simple cheek. I felt it publish in my eye. It's interesting that she'll use the word publish and then later put. Publish in my eye. 'Twas needless any speak. In other words, there was a joy that was translinguistic. Well, I didn't need language. I did not need to say anything. I walked, by the way, pay attention to all the verbs of this poem. I walked as wings my body bore. We'll get, obviously, the flight imagery. We've seen this so regularly in Emily. The feet I former used, unnecessary now to me as boots would be to birds. I didn't even need to walk. I was off the ground. I put my pleasure all abroad. I dealt a word of gold, we're obviously going to get to the golden lions here in a little bit, to every creature that I met, and dowered all the world. In other words, I was there. I had the most amazing, majestic joy in my life. When, dash, suddenly, dash, my riches shrank, dash. Notice the economic language that gets used here. A goblin drank my dew. Now, goblin is interesting. We saw it in 414, you'll recall. We'll see it again in 511 and 590 and 646. We'll see it as well in poem 512. We'll come back to its use here. The soul has bandaged moments when, too appalled to stir, she feels some ghastly fright come up and stop to look at her. Salute her with long fingers, caress her freezing hair, sip. Goblin from the very lips the lover hovered o'er, unworthy that a thought so mean accost a theme so fair. A goblin drank my dew. Now, what is this goblin? That's obviously, we're at the heart of the questions of so many Emily scholars. What is it that led to this break in the joy, right? Which some have argued led to her more reclusive nature, and then ultimately her deciding that she wouldn't even be much seen in public anymore. A goblin drank my dew, my palaces dropped tenantless, myself was beggared too. There is an interesting analysis of much of this in the history of Emily's father's relationship to the very house that Emily was born and raised in. There were moments in time when it wasn't even his house that they were living in, and there was some concern about it. She says, I went from being unbelievably rich to being a beggar, right? Now look at all the verbs. I clutched at sounds. You'll remember clutched from 427. It ends up in 8 poems. I groped at shapes. You'll remember our use of the word grope from 419. We'll see it in so many other poems, 506, 723, 761, 909, and then we really pay attention to it when we get to 1062 and 1555. Those last 2 poems go back to our analysis in 419. We actually read those poems. I groped at shapes. I touched the tops of films. I felt the wilderness roll back along my golden lines. And then she'll finish. The sackcloth hangs upon the nail. In other words, the clothing is now sackcloth. And of course, this is a biblical reference as well. Sackcloth and ashes, as it's often referred to. The frock I used to wear, but where my moment of brocade, my drop of India. Now, when we get to poem 1260, we will come back to this study, because here Emily says it this way. Because that you are going and never coming back, and I, however absolute, may overlook your track, because that death is final, however first it be, this instant be suspended above mortality. Significance that each has lived the other to detect. Discovery not God himself could now annihilate. Eternity, presumption. The instant I perceive that you, who were existence yourself, forgot to live. The life that is will then have been a thing I never knew, as paradise fictitious until the realm of you. The life that is to be, to me, a residence too plain, unless in my Redeemer's face I recognize your own. Of immortality, who doubts? He may exchange with me, curtailed by your obscuring face of everything but he. Of heaven and hell I also yield the right to reprehend to whoso would commute this face for his less priceless friend. If God is love, as he admits, we think that he must be because he is a jealous God. He tells us certainly if all is possible with him, as he besides concedes, he will refund us finally our confiscated gods. What is really this poem suggesting at 2a? I think Emily is again trying to come to terms with loss. Loss is even more profound when we know what we had. Of course, standing behind all of this is the Eden motif, and therefore we have to think about our Milton in Paradise Lost. It's one thing to have never been in Eden and to speculate on the bliss of Eden. It's another thing entirely to know Eden and then to be let out of Eden, never allowed to return. At 2b, the before and after of this poem is quite remarkable. Again, her verbs are quite remarkable in this poem as well. Now again, we don't know what happened suddenly. We're just told a goblin. What was that goblin? At 3a, well, there's so many, things we could relate this to. Think about Tennyson's In Memoriam and his loss of his pal. Think about when we studied Confessions, St. Augustine's Confessions, especially in Book 8, that loss of his pal there. Finally, at 3b, to own a set of lines like this, what was a time when you went from being rich to being a beggar in a relationship? And as Emily's words, ring it all true for you. Thank you.